Hi everybody. So I wanted to make a video talking about the difference between relative risk and absolute risk when it comes to medical interventions in clinical trials. So you're going to see how this is relevant if you watch till the end of the video. But I want to start with a couple hypothetical examples just to get you familiar with the concept, and then we'll move into some more real-world examples using actual data from recent clinical trials. So let's get started. So you can see we have here a table, and this is just going to help us understand the things that we're talking about. So let's start with a hypothetical example. So for our first intervention, we are going to use a toothpaste. Now this is a brand A toothpaste, and what we're looking for is we're looking for people who got one or more cavities. So let's say we have a clinical trial. We have 100 people in the intervention group and 100 people in the control group. What that means is 100 people have used the toothpaste in this trial, and 100 people act as the control group, so they did not use this particular toothpaste. They just did whatever they do normally in their normal life, and that is the control group. So in this hypothetical example, let's say one person in the intervention group gets a cavity. So that's what we're looking for, the specified outcome. We're looking for people who got at least one cavity. Let's say one person in the intervention group got a cavity and 3 people in the control group got a cavity. What that translates to, because we had 100 people in each of the groups, 1% of people who used our toothpaste got a cavity, and 3% of people who did not use our toothpaste got a cavity. Now, we can express that as a risk ratio. So 1 to 3 is the relative risk ratio, or we can express that as a percentage, and that's 33%. So 1% of people, right, who used our toothpaste got a cavity, compared to 3% who did not use our toothpaste got a cavity. So that's 33% of the risk. So if you use our toothpaste, you have 33% the risk of someone who did not use our toothpaste, and that translates to a 67% reduction in risk. So if you have only 33% of the chance of someone else who did not use the toothpaste, that means you have a 67% reduction in your risk of getting a cavity. Now, that is a very valid way to read these statistics, because you're comparing the people who got a cavity in this group, people got a cavity in this group, and it's a 67% reduction, because 1 divided by 3 is 33%, and that means it's 67% less. However, there's another way to interpret this data, and that is the absolute risk reduction. So if we look at this, if you did not use the toothpaste, your risk of getting a cavity was 3%, compared to if you did use the toothpaste, your risk was only 1%. Now, a different way of expressing that is the absolute risk reduction, which is 3% minus 1%, 2% absolute risk reduction. Now, it's important to point out, both of these here are important and relevant and valid interpretations of this data, 67% and 2%, 67% being the relative risk reduction, 2% being the absolute risk reduction. So let's move on to another example here so we can sort of flesh this out a little bit. So let's say now we have toothpaste brand B, and again, we're looking for how many people got one or more cavities using toothpaste brand B. So again, we have 100 people in the intervention group, 100 people in the control group. Now, let's say in this example, 30 people who used the toothpaste got a cavity, but 90 people who did not use our toothpaste got a cavity. Now, in this example, that translates to 30%, right? 30 out of 100 is 30%. Who used the toothpaste got a cavity, compared to 90% who did not use the toothpaste got a cavity. And again, that translates to 33%, or a 67% reduction in risk. Now, the difference here, when we're going to look at absolute risk reduction, 67%, remember the relative risk reduction is the same. However, look at the absolute. So what was your risk if you did not use our toothpaste? 90% that you were going to get a cavity, compared to 30% if you did use our toothpaste. So what that means now is the absolute risk reduction is 60%, because 90 minus 30 is 60%. So the difference here, even though the relative risk reduction is the same, the difference is what is your baseline risk. So if you don't use our intervention, your risk is 90% as compared to 3%. And that's what makes this so different over here. Now, let's move on to a real-world example. So this is a well-known example in the field of statistics. This is Lipitor. So this is a statin, and they did a clinical trial to measure Lipitor's effectiveness against people having heart attacks. So you can see here, the number of participants who took Lipitor was 5,168. The number of participants who did not was 5,103 or 5,137. And we're going to see how many of these people have a heart attack. So over 3 years, I think it was, in the intervention group, people who took Lipitor, 100 people had a heart attack out of 5,168, and people who did not take Lipitor, 154 had a heart attack out of 5,137. And that translates to a risk of 1.9% if you took Lipitor and 3% if you did not take Lipitor. This was over 3 years. So they were looking at how many people had a heart attack in 3 years of either taking Lipitor or not taking Lipitor. So when we do the calculations, 1.9 to 3 is 64%. So if you took Lipitor, you had 64% of the chance of someone not taking Lipitor of having a heart attack, and that translates into a 36% reduction in risk. right? That's the relative risk because you have a 36% less chance of having a heart attack. Now, you can see this in the advertisements for Lipitor. Lipitor reduces risk of heart attack by 36%. They tell you right here. Now, this is pretty great because, well, hold on. We'll get to that in a second. So 36% relative risk reduction. Now we can ask ourselves, what is the absolute risk reduction of Lipitor? So let's go back to this. 3% of people who did not take Lipitor had a heart attack, and 1.9% of people who did take Lipitor had a heart attack. So what is the absolute risk reduction? 1.1%. Now, in fairness, the Lipitor ad actually points this out. In a large clinical study, 3% of patients taking a placebo or sugar pill had a heart attack compared to 2% of patients taking Lipitor. So they show you right here, the difference is about 1%. And in our calculations, we saw it was 1.1. They're just rounding here, but they actually show you this in the ad. And it's pretty funny because if this ad were to read accurately but slightly differently, it would say Lipitor reduces your risk of a heart attack by 1.1%. Now, again, it's important to point out, both of these numbers are accurate and relevant and valid. 36% is the actual relative risk reduction, and that is important. But also, it's important to know that 1.1% is the absolute risk reduction. So if you don't take Lipitor, your chance of having a heart attack over 3 years is 3%. And if you do take Lipitor, that is reduced by 1.1 to 1.9%. So this is also a valid and relevant interpretation of the numbers. Now, let's move on to another real-world example. Some of you may know what I'm referring to here. I'm not going to say it specifically, but let's just call this intervention, let's just call it V, and we'll just say for the sake of demonstration that V sub M. So we're talking about an intervention, we'll just call it V, and we'll give it the subtitle of M. Now, it's important to point out that these are the actual numbers. This was an actual clinical trial that took place, and these are the actual numbers from that clinical trial. So let's take a look at them. So we had 15,210 participants in both arms of this trial. So in the intervention group and the control group, we had the same number of people. Now let's take a look at the number of people who got the outcome that we were trying to prevent. So in the intervention group, 11 people got the outcome and 185 people in the control group got the outcome. Now, what outcome are we talking about? Now, this specific clinical trial outlined 4 criteria that dictated the outcome. So, for example, if you met 3 of these criteria, then the intervention worked and you did not have the outcome. So you had to meet all 4 criteria in order to have this specific outcome. So in the intervention group, 11 people out of 15,210 met all 4 criteria, and in the control group, 185 out of the same number met the criteria. So let's look at the risk percentage. In the intervention group, your risk of meeting these 4 criteria was 0.072%, and in the control group, your risk was 1.21%. Now, let's take a look at the relative risk ratio of those numbers, and it is 6%. So 0.072 as a ratio to 1.21, expressed as a percentage, is 6%. So if you got the intervention, you had 6% of the same chance of someone who did not get the intervention of getting these 4 criteria met. So what that means in terms of the reduction, it's a 94% reduction in your risk by getting this intervention, correct? Now, let's take a look at the absolute risk reduction. 1.13%. So, again, we get that number by subtracting 0.072 from 1.21, and that gives us 1.13%. Now, again, the difference, or the important factor here, is your risk of getting the disease, or meeting these 4 criteria in the first place, if you didn't have the intervention, was only 1.21% in the first place. Now, that's why this absolute risk reduction is so low, because if you do nothing, if you live your life normally, your risk of meeting these 4 criteria to have the specified outcome is only just 1.2%. That's why the absolute risk reduction is so low. So let's take a look at another example. And since we're just making up letters and just using silly examples, let's just call this V sub PF. We'll just call it that for now. And again, they looked at 4 criteria in this study. And again, this is an actual clinical trial. This is the actual numbers from this clinical trial. So let's look at them. So they had 21,000, almost exactly the same amount of number in the intervention and the control groups. And let's look at the people who actually met these 4 criteria. 8 people out of 21,720 compared to 162 out of a similar number. And here are the percentages. So if you took this intervention, your chance of meeting these 4 criteria was this. And if you did not take the intervention, your chance of meeting these 4 criteria was this. So expressed as a ratio, that's 0.036 to 0.74, or 5%. So what does that mean in terms of the reduction? Again, that's a 95% reduction, because if you only have 5% of the risk, that means you have 95% less risk. So again, this is the relative risk reduction, 95%. Now just take a minute and ask yourself, where have you seen these numbers 94%, 95% effective, right? This is what it's referring to, the relative risk reduction. These are the actual numbers from the actual clinical trials, and they result in 94 and 95% relative risk reduction. So let's look at the absolute risk reduction for this final one, and we see it's less than 1%. It's 0.7%. Now again, how did we get that? Well, we took 0.74 minus 0.036, and we get 0.7%. So again, why is this number so low compared to this number? Because your risk of getting the disease, meeting these 4 criteria was only 0.74% in the first place. So that means if you do nothing, your risk of getting these 4 criteria is 0.74%. Now, if you get this intervention, your risk goes down to this number, so that's a 95% reduction, but in absolute terms, your risk was less than 1% to begin with. So how much does this actually reduce your risk? 0.7%. So when you hear that these particular interventions are 94 and 95% effective, you also need to realize that this is another valid interpretation of that data. This is the absolute risk reduction. So this intervention, 94% reduction, 94% effective at reducing at least one of these 4 criteria, translates to a 1.13% absolute risk reduction. And in the case of this particular intervention, visa PF, when meeting these 4 criteria, it reduces your absolute risk by 0.7%. So I hope that was a helpful explanation for everyone. And I hope that when you hear these numbers, 90, 94, 95%, that you will take into account the fact that that is the relative risk reduction and that the absolute risk reduction looks vastly different. And the deciding factor, and what makes that really important, is that your risk of ever having met these criteria in the first place is low to begin with. So that's why the absolute risk reduction is so low compared to the relative risk reduction, because your chance of getting this 4 criteria, if you do nothing, is about 1%. So then a 95% reduction of 1% obviously is not very large, even though, again, both of them are relevant calculations and valid interpretations of the data. However, it's important that you know the absolute risk reduction for these particular interventions are these numbers.